The Engineer class in Deep Rock Galactic is one that is incredibly versatile, highly adaptable, and nearly infinitely useful. If you came here looking for all things mechanical and want to learn all you can about what the Engineer can do, then you are in the right place. What is up guys, Jay here and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to give you the 101 course on how to play the Engineer class in Deep Rock Galactic. Wait, haven't I done this before? Jay here, and today I'm going to give you the 101 course on how to play the Engineer class in Deep Rock Galactic. Yes, I have done a class guide for the Engineer before. However, I have been wanting to revise them for some time now for a few reasons. One, because they were some of my first videos and they were, well, for lack of a better term, rough. And second, I feel like I could have done a much better job going through the classes in much better detail. So today we're going to cover how the Engineer plays, the weapons and gadgets he has access to, the mission types that he is best suited for, as well as some other useful things to note about the Engineer that can help him aid the team. So if you guys are ready, let's talk about Deep Rock Galactic's resident grease monkey, handyman, and all-around technical savant, the Engineer. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to let me know by hitting that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss another upload.
Turrets and explosions. You've come to the right place, mate.
So what does it mean to play the Engineer? What kinds of things does the Engineer do for the team, and how is he meant to be played? Well, the Engineer has the advantage of being very flexible in terms of what he's capable of doing. He's not a one-trick pony, and his kit and overall design allow him to be useful in many different ways. Utility and defense are the Engineer's biggest strengths. His sentry guns allow him to have constant watch on the enemy presence. Also, it essentially will net you free damage and kills when you are not even trying. On the other end, his platform gun may seem like an odd traversal tool at first, but once you figure out the seemingly endless ways that it can be used, from helping out with pipelines to protecting drill dozers, you will find yourself putting cheese everywhere in the caves to make it easier to move around. Now, when it comes to weapons, the Engineer has a very flexible and reliable arsenal to work with. I'll go more into detail with that in the next section, but one thing to keep in mind regarding the Engineer's weapons is that they have probably the most intense sense of power creep in the game. What this means is that the weapons feel very, very different when fully modded out and upgraded compared to their initial default state. So if you're just starting off with the Engineer, keep in mind that his weapons drastically rise in power in the late game compared to the beginning.
God damn it, there's a pebble in my boot.
Now going on to a deeper look at the gear itself, as I just said, the Engineer has an assortment of weapons that complement his style. Now I have gone into most of the Engineer's weapons in greater detail in their own separate videos, so for the sake of repeating myself, I'm not going to give a whole lecture on each of them. However, I am going to talk about the general playstyle of each weapon, as well as any useful mods and even some overclocks that can warp the ways that you play them and use them in the field. The first primary weapon option for the Engineer is the Warthog Auto 210 shotgun. This weapon is the very definition of simple but effective. A semi-auto magazine-fed shotgun that has decent all-around stats and that is good at handling the bugs at close to mid-range. As the default starting weapon, many people are understandably underwhelmed by it, especially if they are coming over from the gunner or driller who have insanely fun and exciting starter weapons. Don't let that fool you, however, because this thing is extremely reliable in the right hands. One of the most powerful things that you can use for the Warthog is its Turret Whip mod. This is one of the mod choices in Tier 5, and it gives the shotgun a ton of extra damage using your sentry gun. Using it, you can fire a round at your sentry gun to cause it to shoot a high explosive shot that only the Warthog can utilize, turning it into a very effective crowd control tool. There are a ton of overclocks that are useful with this weapon, and the one that I like to use the most is magnetic pellet alignment, just to give it some extra accuracy and damage output. But the Warthog does have some crazy ones like cycle overload, which turns it into almost like a shotgun machine gun. Ultimately, it is a really good multi-purpose weapon if you are not really sure what to use in a certain situation, and can be useful on things like elimination and salvage missions. The second primary option for the Engineer is the stubby voltaic SMG. So admittedly, this is probably my least favorite of the Engineer's primary weapons. Not because it's bad, it's actually quite far from it, but because I'm not that crazy about the design. It's just really awkward looking and feels more like a secondary than a primary, at least in my opinion. Personal irrelevant judgment aside, the stubby is also a rather short range option, but instead of a slow shooting shotgun, we have a fast firing electric bullet hose. The stubby has a built-in chance to electrify enemies on hit with a 25% chance, which can be further improved using mods like electric capacitors in Tier 1. The stubby is all about shock damage, and it's best used to lock down as many enemies as possible. Mods like conductive bullets and conductive arc can help get the shock damage up much higher than normal. For overclocks, both of the stubby's unstable overclocks do something crazy. Turret arc lets you create an electric fence if you are using the double sentry guns, which we'll talk about that in a bit, and it can help give you more protection in a wider area if needed. Also, if there are other engineers on your team, you can actually use their sentries for the arcing electricity as well. The other good option is the EM discharge, which allows you to again shoot your sentry, but this time cause it to release a burst of electric energy around it, turning it into essentially a stationary shock grenade. It's great for bottlenecks and can make any closed pathway a death sentence for any glyphid. If you want to bring the stubby, it would do very well on any kind of stationary mission like sabotage or salvage operations. Then lastly for primaries, we have the Lock 1 Smart Rifle, or as I like to call it, the Loki Rifle. One of the core mechanics of this gun is that it is one of the few weapons in the game that has an alternate firing mode. Tapping the fire button will cause a single shot to be fired normally, and holding down the fire button will cause a targeting interface to appear and begin putting marks on enemies within range. Upon releasing the fire button, the weapon fires at all enemies that were locked onto with the amount of bullets displayed on each indicator. When a locked on enemy is killed, any excess locks will not cause additional shots to be fired, conserving ammo. When using this other firing mode, anything blocking the tracers will be shot instead, which can include terrain, teammates, or other enemies. So that was a lot of fancy words and explanation that basically sums up the Loki rifle being one of the engineer's most complicated weapons to use. It has a bit of a learning curve to it, but if you can learn how to properly use it and angle the shots correctly, it can dish out a lot of damage. For mods, it's kind of difficult to explain what is effective since the rifle has a lot of different stats, but things like shutter speed sensor can help you take out a lot of things, and unstable lock-on can be used for single target damage. For overclocks, there are a few interesting options that you can consider. Explosive chemical rounds can be really good for large groups as it makes the targets explode if they have just a few locks on them. And Executioner is very good for taking on huge single target threats like dreadnoughts. In short, the Smart Rifle is a bit intimidating to use at first, but once you get the hang of it and feel familiar with it, it is very, very effective. On missions like Elimination and Sabotage, the Smart Rifle can be very useful. The engineer's secondary weapons are no less important and effective than his primaries. The first of his secondary weapons is his trusty explosive lobber, the Deep Core Grenade Launcher. Similar to the Warthog shotgun, the launcher is simple but extremely elegant and effective, following the same principles that govern most grenade launchers in gaming. With a slight projectile arc to compensate for, the Deep Core can take out a big cluster of enemies while leaving those left standing in pretty bad shape. It also has a good fear factor to it to help break up the enemy swarms, and good armor shredding to help with those big dreadnoughts or caretakers. The grenade launcher is sweet and simple and does its job very well. Save it for those big bad enemies or those cluster of fodder bugs and you will see the beauty of it in action. For mod choices, it really does depend on what overclocks you are running. If you're running hyper propellant, which is probably my personal favorite, then you can pair this up with spike grenades for further improved direct damage and turn this thing into essentially a railgun. Or if you want to be really fun, you can use the RJ-250 compound to fly through the air like a dwarf with wings. The grenade launcher is a good all-around choice for secondaries, and if you want to take it, missions like Elimination, Sabotage, or Salvage are good choices for it. The second option for secondaries in the engineer's arsenal is the breach cutter. I've already talked before about how this thing is some kind of mad science experiment gone wrong. The true testament of the breach cutter's capabilities is its versatility. The cutter can do very strong burst damage, and the fact that it can completely bypass terrain and obstacles means that essentially nothing is safe from this thing. The damage it does is very strong and it is able to cleave through armor very efficiently. The only real issue with the breach cutter is its low ammo supply. You'll burn through it pretty quickly, and as such, it should not be used too harshly for fear of running out. In terms of mod choices, there are a lot of different ways that you can build it, but personally I have always been a fan of the plasma trail combined with better armor breaking so that essentially anything that has armor will have a difficult time existing. For overclocks, two fun ones that I like to use are first roll control, which lets you turn the laser mid-flight, which isn't super viable in most cases, but it's pretty fun to use, and another one is spinning death, which causes the laser to, instead of traveling, simply spin around at the location it's fired and act as a glyphid garbage disposal. The fun thing about the breach cutter is that it can be built for so many different strategies. That being said, it can also find a place in pretty much almost any mission type as well. The third secondary weapon option for the engineer is the Shard Diffractor, a huge laser beam that would make Tony Stark shed a single tear of joy. The Diffractor is probably my personal favorite secondary weapon for the engineer. It is capable of pumping out strong, consistent damage that also has the power to disintegrate enemies into ash. The weapon has built-in heat damage, so it can set enemies on fire, which can be very useful for those more durable threats. The weapon also has essentially infinite range, so you can eliminate threats even if all you can see is a single pixel of their body. Depending on how you set up the Diffractor, it can be used almost as often as your primary weapon in terms of ammo usage. Using mods like biomass converters can extend the beam's use, making it great for controlling large groups, while things like soft tissue disruption can make hitting weak spots very effective. Based on what you want to use the Shard Diffractor for will determine how you build it. but for me, I tend to primarily use it for dealing heavy damage to bigger enemies. For overclocks, my personal go-to is Overdrive Booster, because it lets you essentially put the beam into high damage mode where you can't move, but the beam does insane amounts of damage. But some other good choices are things like Feedback Loop, or just efficiency tanks would be good too. Again, like the Breach Cutter, any mission is really good for this thing, but things like Sabotage or even Refining missions could be good choices.
I'm wondering if fighting bugs and moving dirt is the best way to make a living.
For grenade choices, the Engineer has some pretty good ones as well. The Lure Grenade makes a holographic decoy that attracts enemies to it using some sweet dance moves, making them good at corralling enemies into groups so you can easily use things like your grenade launcher or turret whip shot to take them out. The Plasma Bursters send out waves of energy that are capable of doing some really good damage if you can get the enemies in a line. I tend to bring these on escort missions for the tunnel sequences because it lines them up very well. Proximity mines are a good general choice for defense-heavy missions, as they detonate whenever an enemy gets close to them and they have several explosions before they run out. And lastly, the Shredder Swarm Grenades are a good multi-purpose option that can really be good in almost any scenario. They create several hacked Shredder drones that will attack enemies for you and make your life a little bit easier. They last for a decent amount of time and can be really useful if running solo. For support tools, the Engineer has the ever-mentioned Sentry Gun. The Sentry Gun is an autonomous defense turret that once placed onto the ground and fully constructed, it will indiscriminately fire at enemies that enter its range and view. Sentry has its own pool of ammo that it draws from and an amount of loaded ammo that is indicated above the player's normal ammo counter. When the Sentry runs out of loaded ammo, the player has to interact it with the Sentry to reload it manually. The gun itself has some interesting choices of upgrades that you can choose from, but there is really one that determines a lot about how the Sentry is going to play, and that's the first slot where you can choose either the Gemini system upgrade, which gives you 2 Sentry guns instead of 1 with more ammo to compensate, or the Mark II Sentry gun, which keeps only 1 Sentry but makes it a lot more powerful. This is going to determine heavily on what the rest of your kit is like. If you have the Turret Whip Shotgun or the Turret Arc Stubby, then you may want to bring the Gemini systems for multiple turrets. If you are getting a little overwhelmed by handling and managing 2 sentries and their ammo, then you may want to stick with just the 1. The biggest thing that the sentries provide is free extra damage. Since they will constantly be trying to find enemies to shoot, you could focus on doing the normal mission objectives while your sentries rack up the kill count for you. Not only will they be helping you, but your entire team by eliminating pressure. As such, keep them deployed at all times whenever you can. A good practice is whenever you hear mission control start to announce a swarm coming at you, immediately place it wherever you are. Remember also that when you are moving to a new spot that you can hold the reload button to recall your sentry back to you, which will also reload it. The last piece of the proverbial Engineer puzzle is his traversal tool, the platform gun, or as I've heard it referred to as, the cheese cannon. This thing is probably the biggest factor that gives the Engineer his utility. You shoot it at a wall and it forms a nice circular platform that you and your allies can stand on. And you can also place things on it, such as a resupply, setting up a pipeline, or just making a path. Probably the most useful and common thing you are going to do with your platforms is to put them underneath really high minerals in the ceiling or walls so that your scout can zip to it and collect them. So if you hear your scout wildly pinging a resource node, then that is probably why. The cool thing is that you can actually put platforms attached to other platforms. So with enough time and effort, you can essentially make a bridge, a staircase, or even a whole floor for your team to use. Some common things to get in the hang of using the platforms for are first, using them to help with pipeline placement. Your driller can cut through terrain, but if there is no terrain to use, then you need to help him with that. Also, something else you can do is to use them on escort missions to protect Doretta from the falling rocks. It'll only work once or twice, so it should kind of be used as a last resort, but it can still work. Case in point, the platforms are like the Swiss Army knife of traversal tools. Regardless of the angle or terrain setup, all you gotta do is use a little bit of brain power and you can essentially make whatever you want.
Identify targets and exterminate. That's how it's done.
So when it comes to mission specialties, based on what we have seen so far, the Engineer definitely excels at more defensive-oriented objectives. His ability to control large areas and essentially manipulate the flow of enemies into certain spots can help out a lot with enemy management. Escort missions are a good pick because you can have a solid constant defense of the drill dozer while also handling enemies. These ones I like to use the double sentry guns for maximum coverage, but that's just me. Also, industrial sabotage is a good choice for similar reasons. Having good coverage for the hacking pods will make the whole process go much smoother. Plus, the Engineer's weapons are quite good for the final boss fight with the Caretaker. Lastly, elimination missions can benefit from the Engineer's good armor shredding capabilities. He has a lot of tools that can help with making the dreadnoughts more vulnerable. So in summary, the Engineer is a class that has a lot of flexibility, with the only real drawback being that his early game is pretty slow. You have to build up a lot in order to make the Engineer's kit as strong as it can be. He's not about incredible burst damage, but more about sustained, constant, and controlled damage. keeping the pressure on the bugs almost all the time. Learning when to use the platforms, good spots for the sentry guns, or even just when to dump your grenades are all good ways to learn the engineer. Well, there you have the guide on learning how to play the engineer. Hopefully you learned a few things, and hopefully I did a better job than I did before. Honestly, even I have learned so many new things since I did that last video that this was very informative for me as well. Anyway, I hope you guys found this video helpful. If you did, please be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, as it tells me what types of videos you guys want to see. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.